Energy flow. Today I'm going to discuss how energy actually flows in an ecosystem. What you should be able to describe after watching this video is you should be able to define what food chains and webs are. You should be able to define what a trophic level is. You should be able to describe to me how energy actually flows in an ecosystem. Where does it start? Where does it end up? You should be able to tell me how much energy actually moves up the food chain through each link. You need to be able to describe the three pyramid models for energy flow. And finally, you need to be able to describe or define biomagnification. So food chains and webs. So all organisms are a potential source of energy for other organisms. The sequence of actually who eats who is known as a food chain. So a food chain is a linear progression from one organism to another showing what eats what. And one of the key things about a food chain is that the arrows show the energy flow. So the energy flows, in this case in the food chain, in the example here, from the sun to the plants, to the rabbit, to the owl, to the fungi, to the mushrooms. So you notice that the arrows do not point in the direction of who eats what. The arrows point in the direction of where the energy is actually flowing. So from the grass, it flows into the rabbit and then into the owl. So make sure you're careful about which way you put your arrows. So food chains are strictly a what eats what and how does the energy flow in a linear progression. A little more about food chains. All food chains technically start out with energy from the sun. Usually we don't put that because it's just a known fact that the sun is the main source of energy for the planet. The first level of the food chain is the producer level, which is usually plants. It doesn't have to be plants, but in most of our terrestrial or land-based food chains, it's plants. So they're producing the food, so they're producers. Usually food chains can only go up to about 4 or 5 levels. So there's usually 4 to 5 organisms in the food chain, which I'll explain why a little bit later. It deals with the amount of energy that actually can go up each level of the food chain. And finally, all things eventually die. So eventually all food chains are connected back to the decomposer level. So you notice in this case you have producers. They get eaten by the herbivores gets eaten by the carnivore, and the carnivore gets eaten by another carnivore. But in the end they all die. So in the end the fungi are going to decompose the dead organisms and return those nutrients back into the cycle. Every organism and ecosystem has a feeding level or a trophic level. So troph means energy, so trophic level means your energy level, so it's your feeding level. So producers are your first trophic level. They're the bottom layer of the food chain since they're producing, so they're the first one, the base. Then you have the second trophic level, which is the organisms that eat the producers. Because they're the first level, we call them the primary consumers. They're the first consumers that are eating the producers directly. Then we have the third trophic level, which are the secondary consumers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, and so forth. So then you can keep going up. Third level is known as tertiary. So the tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers. And then you have the fourth level consumer, and usually you don't go above fourth level consumers. So each one is just a successive level increasing in number. And you always eat one below what you actually are. When you eat organisms, you obviously are getting energy from that organism. However, you are not getting 100% of the energy stored in that organism. Most of the energy is actually lost during the transformation from organism to organism. So where does the actual energy go? Well, about 50% of the energy in your body is lost as waste, as feces. So a good half the energy is actually just useless as feces. Another 33% of that energy is wasted in cellular respiration. So cellular respiration, that process of making ATP, is not perfectly efficient. You do lose quite a bit of energy during that process. So those are just the energy lost to daily living. So only about 17% of all the energy that you get is actually used for growth. And that is the energy that actually can move on. So the vast majority of energy in an organism is lost to the environment and does not actually move on to the next level in the food chain. How much energy can you get from your food? The energy that is actually stored in the organism is what you can get, so about that 17%. But that 17% is ideal. It's on the high end of the estimate. However, honestly, it's about 90% of the energy is lost in an organism. So only 10% of the energy of an organism is actually moved on to the next level. So when you eat a salad, you're only getting 10% of the energy stored in that salad. When you eat a cow, you're getting 10% of the energy stored in the cow, which only got 10% of the energy stored in the grass. So when you consume a cow, you're getting only 1% of the entire energy that was originally in that grass. So you can see that's why it's usually beneficial to eat at a lower trophic level, to eat more plants, to eat more vegetables, because they actually have more energy and you don't have to consume as much. So you can see an example of this food chain. Plants have the most energy. Herbivores, you're losing 90%, so they only get 10%. Carnivores, the next little radish mouse looking thing, they're getting 10% of 10%, so that's only 1%. The snake is getting 10% of 1%, which is 0.1%. And finally, the bird that is eating the snake is getting 10% of 0.1%. So that high-level bird is only getting 0.01% of the entire energy that's actually in the original plant. So each higher level you go, there's less and less energy, and you actually have to consume more to survive. This is why food chains can only be 4 to 5 levels. Eventually, there's just not enough energy in the higher up you go in the food chain to actually keep the organisms alive at that level. Food chains are the basic what eats what, how does energy flow from point A to point B, from point B to point C. If you want to look at the entire ecosystem and how energy flows between all the different organisms and which way all the different paths it can go, you need to make a food web. So a food web is basically a whole bunch of food chains that are all connected together. So food webs, even though they're more complicated than food chains, they're still very simplistic. So a food web shows all the different ways that energy can flow in an ecosystem. Here's an example of a food web of the African savanna. You notice there are two producers. You have grasses and you have the acacia tree. And you can see all of the arrows show all the different ways that energy can actually flow in this ecosystem. So the acacia could give its energy to the giraffe, which could give its energy to the lion, or the impala could eat the acacia and then get eaten by the leopard, and the leopard could also eat the hyena. So you can see there's a whole bunch of different ways that the energy can actually flow. So once again, remember the arrows point in the direction of energy flow. So the acacia is not eating the impala. The energy is going from the acacia tree into the impala. So a food web is a complicated form of a food chain, and it shows all the different ways that energy can actually flow. There are 3 ways to show the amounts of energy or matter contained at each trophic level. They're the pyramid of numbers, the energy flow pyramid, and the biomass pyramid. We'll go through each one of them individually. The first one is known as a pyramid of numbers, which is literally the amount of the number of organisms at each trophic level. So it's the number of oak trees, the number of caterpillars, the number of blue tits, the number of sparrowhawks is the pyramid of numbers. So it would be like 5 oak trees, 5 caterpillars, 4 blue tits, 1 sparrowhawk. Since the typical ecological structure is mostly producers with less primary consumers and just a few secondary consumers, usually the pyramid has a pyramid shape, because usually you have way more grass, then you have caterpillars, then you have little birds, then you have big birds. So pyramid numbers usually actually shows a pyramid shape. It doesn't have to, but usually it has that pyramid shape. So another example of a pyramid of numbers, you have your first trophic level, the base of your pyramid, which is the producers, 1,500 blades of grass. Then you have your second level primary consumers, 29 grasshoppers. Secondary consumers, third trophic level, 8 frogs. And then finally you have 1 eagle, which is the tertiary consumer. So every time you notice there's less and less number of organisms because there's less and less energy due to only 10% being carried up it. The second type of pyramid is known as an energy flow pyramid. This explains why the Earth can support more people if we eat at a lower trophic level. So if you eat more at the producer level, there's more energy, therefore you can support more and more individuals. This also explains why when there is an ecological disaster, the first ones that get affected are your carnivores, because they need to eat so much food to get the energy they need to survive that if there's a disruption in the food at the producer level, there's just not enough secondary consumers for them to get enough food to actually survive. So an energy flow pyramid shows the amount of energy at each level. Once again, because only 10% is being carried, the producers have the most, and each level is less and less. So the higher up you go, the less energy, the less organisms are able to survive at that level. Another example, you can see that you have, once again, that 100% of the energy at the producer level, only 10% is carried, so 10% at the primary consumer level, 10% of that, 1% is at the secondary consumer level, and finally you have 0.1% at the tertiary consumer level. And energy flow is one direction only. Unlike the water cycle and the carbon cycle, which we'll talk about later, energy flow is once it's used up, we cannot recycle it. So once it gets to that tertiary consumer, there's no way to put that energy back into the producer level. So it is a unidirectional, it only goes up the food chain and never goes back down the food chain. Finally, the last type of pyramid we have is the biomass pyramid. So this actually represents the amount of potential food. So biomass is the amount of living matter per a unit area. So it's saying like 500 grams of living material in a 1 hectare, 1 acre area. So biomass pyramid is just looking at the amount of food at each level. And it is just the same shape as the other ones. There's more biomass at the producer level compared to the primary consumer compared to the tertiary. So you can see you start out with 5,000 grams of grain, then you have 500 grams of chicken, and then you have 50 grams of human tissue. So biomass is just the amount of living material in a unit area. And just like the other ones, it makes a pyramid shape usually. However, it doesn't have to make a pyramid shape. So ideally, in this case, you're looking at the grass, the rabbit, and the fox, so a normal like forest ecosystem. The pyramid numbers, the pyramid of biomass, and the pyramid of energy all have a very fat base, all have then a skinnier middle and a very skinny top because of the amount of energy being lost. However, if you look at a marine ecosystem, there's actually more zooplankton than there are phytoplankton. So you can see that their pyramid is not a perfect pyramid shape. However, the pyramid of energy is always a pyramid shape. Pyramid of energy, there always has to have the fat base with the producer level and going less and less as you go up. The other two don't necessarily have to be pyramid shapes, though they usually are. Last thing I want to tell you about, so energy decreases as we go up the food chain. However, there is something that actually increases as we go up the food chain, and that is pollutants. So chemicals actually and toxins actually increase in their concentration as we move up the food chain. This is known as biomagnification or biological magnification. So as you go up the food chain, the chemicals magnify. So pollutants can be non-degradable, which means that they actually can't be broken down. Mercury is a perfect example of this. Mercury is a heavy metal. There is no way for us to metabolize it. So when we consume food with mercury, it actually just stays in our body. So what actually happens is that as you go up and up the food chain, it becomes more and more concentrated. Because you need more and more energy, the duck at the top here has to consume lots and lots of fish. Well, each of those fish had to consume lots and lots of plankton. Each of those plankton had to suck in some water. So you can see originally you start out with 2 parts per million of this toxin. Well, the plankton have to drink the water, so they get about 5 parts per million. Well, this middle-sized fish has to eat so much plankton that it actually gets a ton of this chemical in it, and so it's up to 200 parts per million concentration of this chemical. And then the duck has to eat so much of this fish to stay alive and get enough energy that that concentration goes up to 1,600 parts per million. So biomagnification is the idea that as you go up the food chain, the amount of chemicals and toxins actually increase in the higher order or the higher level consumers. And this is what I just explained about this idea that because the large animals, there's not a lot of food, not a lot of energy in the secondary consumers, that they can't just eat one or two, they have to consume maybe thousands or millions of these animals in their lifetime. So not only do you get the energy from them, you're actually getting all their toxins. So you can see another example. You start out with 0.000003 parts per million. Then in the zooplankton you have 0.04. Then the small fish you have 0.5. The large fish you have 2. And then finally the bird has 25. So you can see how much of a difference 25 parts per million compared to even 0.04% in zooplankton. This is why they tell you to be careful of how much tuna you eat, because tuna is already a high-level consumer. It has a lot of toxins, it has a lot of mercury in it, so you have to be careful how much you consume because you can't get rid of that mercury once you consume it.